Okay, Dr. Thompson, shall we start?
Sure. Yes. Is it 1:30?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good night, everyone. I would like to welcome you all in behalf of the Human Sciences Club at KFUPM and its members. We are glad to host this distinguished webinar in a crucial topic with an amazing, brilliant speaker, Dr. Mark Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a senior research fellow and the head of Socioeconomics unit at King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. Not to mention that Dr. Thompson was an assistant professor at the Global and Social Studies department here at KFUPM. Welcome, Dr. Thompson, and you have the mic.
Salam alaikum. Good evening, everybody. And it's lovely. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ali, for your generous introduction, and also for reaching out to me originally and asking me to come and join your club this evening. Obviously, in the past, I spoke at a lot of other KFUPM student clubs over the years. The book club, the Scouts, the public relations club. I realize this is a new club that you've started recently, so it's sort of lovely to reconnect with you and to sort of be doing something with the university again. I actually keep in touch with a great many of my former students, and in fact, I had dinner on Saturday evening with a student who attended my first ever class at KFUPM in semester 121. He's now actually doing a MBA at Harvard Business School. So he's come a long way since then. So it's great to sort of actually talk to you, some of you. And there's several students here I can see who've joined us this evening, who I taught in the past. So that's lovely as well. Of course, all my students are joking. My former students have been joking with me this week and last week, saying, you can't get away, Dr. Mark. You even if you try to get away, you can't. And certainly, I miss the teaching, and I miss the interaction with the students. Although I have to say, all through this year, had numerous Zoom meetings with groups of students, and I see students all the time. So I still feel very connected to KFUPM in many ways, although I must say I don't miss the majors, which I'm sure everybody would agree with. So this evening, my talk this evening is going to be very informal. It's not going to be a lecture because I don't think that's appropriate for this sort of setting, as this is a club. So I hope that what I'm going to say is going to sort of raise, sort of some questions from you as well, or comments. And I'm actually going to pose a couple of questions whilst I speak for something for you to think about. And after I finish sort of talking to you, then maybe we can have a discussion about some of the topics that I've raised. I think one or two people have also sort of pointed out that they might want to raise a question about what may or may not happen tomorrow, because that's obviously a huge topic that's going to be happening as well. So yes, it is very informal, although I might give you a quiz at the end. We'll have to see. No, I'm joking. So when Ali was sort of approached me originally about asking me maybe what could I talk about, and I was sort of, there's so many different topics and so many different issues that have sort of been raised, particularly this year. But then I realized that in the Zoom meetings that I was having with former students who were contacting me, asking me if we could have a discussion, I remember that one of the things that I was sort of constantly saying to them about the COVID-19 pandemic was that this was really the third major sort of historical turning point in my life. In other words, it was the third event where I could refer to pre and post, if you like, So pre the pandemic, post the pandemic. And as you've probably seen from the posters and from the advertisement, you know, the other two would be sort of pre the end of the Cold War, post the end of the Cold War, pre the advent of the internet, post the advent of the internet. And these, when I look back at my life, yes, there have been lots of sort of other things that have happened and sort of quite momentous events. But these are the three that really stand out to me as the events that sort of changed the course of not just my life, but the course of socioeconomics, sociopolitics, and affected our families and our communities. And I think, again, what ties these three events together is that they're not necessarily single events, like, say, for example, 9/11 was a single event that happened on one day. In fact, these three events, all three of them, happened over sort of a period of time, over a couple of years. And there were multiple events that happened within the overall event, if you like. And so that's why I thought, well, you know, I'm having this conversation with so many people anyway, and it's so relevant to everything that we've seen happen this year, that I felt that this was something that I could talk about from a historical point of view, but also, of course, we can talk about it as something very contemporary, something in terms of the pandemic, something that's happening to us now, all of us, and therefore I think that, you know, that this makes it sort of a lot more relevant to you as well. So the first event that I mentioned, of course, was the end of the Cold War, which happened, the end of the Cold War happened from 1989 to 1991. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But the reason why this is very important for me personally, and why I sort of, you know, see this as sort of the sort of first major historical turning point in my life, was because this completely altered the way that I saw the world. I grew up in a certain way, which was completely dominated by the Cold War. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you know, after the Second World War in 1945, during the Second World War, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, the USSR, were allies against the Axis powers, including Nazi Germany. Now, at the end of 1945, the rivalry started between the United States and the Soviet Union, a major, major rivalry. So suddenly they went from being allies to being bitter enemies. And the whole period from 1945 to 89-91 was dominated by this rivalry between two huge superpowers. And what was interesting about the world at that point was that in many ways, understanding politics during those years was easier than it is today, because it was fairly understandable that you were either with them or with us. You were either, you know, in the camp of the United States, as it were, or in you know, sort of within their sort of region of influence, or with the Soviet Union. Now, of course, the Soviet Union came into being during the First World War. The Russian Revolution on its own is a major historical turning point. And when the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union in 1917, and the birth of the Soviet Union and a completely new type of state, a completely new type of power. When we talk about the Soviet Union and when we talk about the Cold War, what we also have to remember is that during the Second World War, it was actually the Soviet Union that bore the brunt of the fatalities and the destruction. You know, approximately 400,000 Americans died during the Second World War, in comparison to something like 26 million Soviet citizens, may probably a lot more. So this had a major impact. Obviously, the destruction in the Soviet Union was unbelievable. The scale of the death was absolutely unbelievable. And this had a major impact on the way that the Soviet Union behaved after 1945. Now, I was born in 1961, and I was actually born on the day that the Berlin Wall was built. Now, some of you might have been to Berlin, and you would have seen, where the wall used to run. Of course, the wall was incredibly symbolic because it didn't just divide the city of Berlin. It divided Germany as well, because you had East and West Germany, you had East and West Berlin. And so East Berlin, East Germany was in the Soviet camp. West Berlin, West Germany was in the United States camp, as it were. So I was actually born at this point, at this incredibly sort of contentious, very fraught period in history when this division emerged in Berlin. And that's how I grew up. So my life as a child, as a teenager, as an undergraduate, when I first went to university in 1978, I think it was dominated by the Cold War and dominated by a fear of nuclear Armageddon, of nuclear war. Nuclear war wasn't something that was abstract to us in those years. Nuclear war was real. Nuclear war was something that we were all very frightened about. Nuclear war was actually something that we expected to happen. And in fact, as I said, I was born in 61, and just after I was born in 63, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets put nuclear ballistic missiles onto Cuba, which was of course in striking distance of the United States. And at that point during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came to the brink of nuclear Armageddon, this close. And so my parents, I can remember my parents telling me how, they just had me as a baby and how they thought, right, that's it, it's all over, it's all going to finish. Fortunately, it didn't, because I'm still here and you still have majors regardless of the pandemic. But that's how we lived. I mean, we lived with this sort of sense of dread, with this sense of fear that there would be some sort of massive conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So at school, there were always debates about nuclear weapons and about, what might happen. And it dominated our lives. And we didn't really think at that time that this was going to sort of go away. Now, I was very fortunate that my parents, I grew up all over the world, and my parents, took me pretty much everywhere where they went. So I traveled extensively all through my life. But for my 21st birthday present from my parents, I had my first trip to the Soviet Union in 1981 when I visited Moscow and Leningrad, as it was called then, after Lenin. It's since reverted back to its original name of St. Petersburg. And when I went there, it was at the height of the Cold War. The ruler the head of the Soviet Union was Brezhnev. And the tension, there was great tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, between the East and the West. All my friends for their 21st birthdays went to Spain and beach parties and things like this, but I went to Moscow and Leningrad, which they all thought I was completely crazy. But it was fascinating and a very important moment in my life. What struck me most, of course, when I was there, and something that I was completely unaware of, was the economic problems within the Soviet Union. And so I can remember sort of escaping from my group, because we weren't supposed to go off on our own, but I did. And sort of walking around Moscow, walking around Leningrad, and seeing these huge queues in the streets, and wondering what are those queues for? And I would sort of go to the front and sort of have a look and look into the shop where all these people were queuing, and they would be selling like potatoes. And that's all there was in the shop. There was almost nothing. And yet this was a sort of a superpower that we were all terrified of. What was interesting was that obviously as foreigners visiting the Soviet Union in those days, you had to stay in specific hotels. And within those hotels, there were actually supermarkets. And in the supermarkets, they sold everything. You could get everything, but you could only buy things with US dollars. And of course, the average Soviet citizen couldn't get hold of US dollars. So A, they weren't allowed to go into these stores, but B, even if they had gone into the stores, they wouldn't have been able to buy anything because they didn't have any currency. And of course, only certain Soviets had access to these stores and had access to currency. So this is a very good example that wasta is nothing new and doesn't just exist here. It is something that's existed all through history and in all different environments. You know, I would go out into the streets, I remember, and the first thing that would happen to me was people would come up and try and buy my jeans, try and buy Levi's, you know, because that was very much a status symbol. But you, again, you know, you couldn't sell them because they would just give you Soviet money back, which there's nothing that you could do about it. So that really, really struck me that time I was there. And I went back to the Soviet Union several times after that. And the last time I went back was in 1985, I think it was. And that's when Gorbachev had just come to power, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, who started to open up to the West. And I actually traveled to the Soviet Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, as they were then, under the control of the Soviet Union. What was fascinating at that point, of course, was that, like in Uzbekistan, for example, which is a Muslim country, all the mosques were closed. It was illegal for the mosques to be open, just as it was, you know, the same all across the Soviet Union with churches. But I remember going past this huge government state farm in the coach, which obviously we could see from the trucks was a tomato farm. And there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trucks at the side of the road full of tomatoes just lying there, rotting. You know, they weren't being taken anywhere. They were just rotting. And all of this, you know, these were things that I saw so many examples of this in the years that I traveled to the Soviet Union, and made me realize actually that there were these huge structural problems within the Soviet Union that we didn't really sort of know that much about. So when the Cold War suddenly ended, and it did happen quite suddenly, you know, for many people it was a great shock. You mean you had the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then you had this sort of relatively peaceful collapse of the states across Eastern Europe until 1991, when Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, sort of signed a decree basically saying the Soviet Union no longer exists. The flag was lowered on the Kremlin, and that was it. It was gone. And this was something that none of us had ever envisaged would happen. You know, of course, there was enormous elation and huge optimism that this terrible threat of nuclear war, that the nuclear Armageddon that we've lived with all our lives suddenly seemed to have disappeared. And there was, you know, there's a lot of optimism at that point. You know, a feeling that, you know, we'd sort of passed out of maybe a very dark period, and that we were going to sort of enter into a sort of new, sort of more peaceful, more prosperous sort of future. Well, obviously we weren't right, but that's what we believed at the time. And if you go back to that time, you can see, for example, that there was like an famous academic called Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book called The End of History, you know, where he was basically sort of saying, you know, sort of the West has won, and, you know, everything's going to be a lot better. I remember reading that book. I think it was in 1992 when I first moved to South Korea to work, and you know, I remember reading a couple of chapters and then thinking, I'm not so sure about this. but this was, you know, this really was a huge turning point, you know, because it wasn't just the fact that this empire had disappeared, but a lot of new nations came into being. The whole nature of what Russia was changed. Lots of states that had been under sort of domination of the Soviet Union suddenly became independent states, like the ones I just mentioned, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Of course, Germany reunited as well. So East and West Germany disappeared. So it was a fundamentally political change. And and a good example, if you're not sure about quite how big that change was, is go and have a look at a world map before 1989, and then look at a world map, sort of post, as it were, and you see all of the new states that suddenly came into being. So this was a really, this is a really good example of what I talked about, as sort of, a life we had pre this and a life we had post this. Now, of course, that optimism, that sort of hope in the 90s obviously disappeared. I think a lot of people would use 9/11 as a sort of marker, as to sort of as a sort of a point when that ended, and then of course as we know, we sort of started getting into sort of a lot more complicated, a lot more sort of pessimistic times, if you like, that have sort of started around that time, that have gone on subsequently. Of course, what happened next in the 90s was sort of the next sort of major sort of turning point in my life. And that was the advent of the internet. And again, we can talk about sort of life before the internet and life after the internet. Now, I know maybe for a lot of you, that's something that you can't really envisage. No Snapchat, no WhatsApp, no YouTube, but nothing, we didn't have anything like that. And this communications revolution that happened at the end of the 1990s fundamentally changed our lives in every way. Extraordinary. If you look at science fiction films from the 1970s or the 1960s, for example, they'll show you flying cars and robots and all of this sort of stuff. But what they didn't predict was this communications revolution that happened. So it wasn't the flying robots and things like that happened. It was this that happened. And if somebody had shown me this when I was your age, when I was an undergraduate, and had told me what this can do, I would not have believed that something like this would exist in my lifetime. This would have been complete science fiction. So, and yet this was something that happened so quickly. So, as I said just before, I had been teaching at university in South Korea, and I moved there in the early 90s when South Korea transitioned from a military dictatorship to a democracy. And I remember towards the end of my time in South Korea going into my boss's office, and she was incredibly excited because she had this enormous sort of desktop on her desk, and she was quite lucky to have one like this because there weren't that many around, even in Korea in those days. And she was incredibly excited. She said, "Oh, look, it's the internet." And of course, I was like, yeah, so what? I had no idea what the internet was. I'd never even heard of it. Some of you I know, I can see, who studied the globalization course with me, know that we talked about this and, how the internet came into being and when the internet first went public. What's very important, my anecdote that I'm going to tell you now is actually something that happened to all of us. Is that, 97, I think it was, this Professor Kim, she says to me, this is the internet. I didn't know what she was talking about. I'd never used a computer in my life before. Computers were very, very rare. My late brother was one of the few people who actually did IT training, went to university to do IT training in sort of the early 80s. But in those days, this was not, it wasn't really something that many people did. You didn't see many computers. So for example, my first master's dissertation that I wrote by hand and then had somebody type it up for me. And that was, that was normal. That's how things were done. So 97, I see this thing called the internet. By 99, I think it was like 99, the end of 1999, I was doing computer courses in London. I'd gone back to the UK. I was doing computer courses in London, and every place that you could think of, whether it was a public library, whether it was colleges, universities, private shops, everywhere that you could think of was offering computer courses. And Microsoft, of course, sort of, Word and PowerPoint and all of these sorts of things had just started to come out. And, we were all doing courses in these things. Now that happened in that tiny, tiny, tiny frame of, if you think of history, it was just a millisecond that happened, that all of us suddenly started to use this new technology. Why? Because we could all see what the benefits of this were. It was blindingly obvious to everybody that this was going to change things. And so there was really no question that you weren't actually going to go and sort of train yourself, because I realized that, my goodness, if I don't get sort of au fait with this technology, then that's my job prospects are not going to be very good in the future. So this was a massive, 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 massive change. For the best, yes, I think overall. I mean, I think one of the questions obviously we can think about for later is, in terms of the new technology that happened sort of post sort of 97, 99, what are the positives and what are the negatives about all of this? Because there are clearly both. I think overall, I think it's positive, but there are definite sort of negatives as well. But if you think about, if we sort of take this now to a little bit more local, if you like. When I first came to Saudi Arabia, the first week of January 2001, when I was working in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in January 2001 was a very, very different place to Saudi Arabia today. Saudi Arabia still felt quite isolated in those days. The world felt quite far away from Saudi Arabia. If I wanted to speak to my parents, there were very few mobile phones or anything like this. There were some, but they were sort of like about this big. But if I wanted to go speak to my parents, for example, I'd have to go to the shop on the corner with the little cabins, where you used to phone people up from. Which I don't know, maybe some of you might remember those, but that's what you did, and so the world was very distant. Now think about today, and I used to say this to my students at KFUPM: where is the world today? Well, the world today is in your pockets, because you have the world on here. You can do everything on here, basically, and this is now you think about that. This technology has created this unbelievable social revolution. When you only have to think about the impact of social media on Saudi Arabia, let alone in the world. You think about Saudi Arabia having some of the highest internet, highest internet penetration in the world, highest uses of social media, and the way that it's changed how you as people conduct your daily transactions, the way you deal, the fact that we're doing this now, is a perfect example of that. Over the last sort of 9 months, I mean, how many times did I think to myself, thank goodness, we had this technology. I mean, I was in isolation in the UK on my own until fairly recently, for a very long time, actually. I was working because of this technology. I was still able to give presentations, still able to attend conferences. I'm still able to work for King Faisal Centre, even though we were all at home, rather like yourselves. But what would we have done without this technology during this very, very difficult time? So I think, I think you can definitely see that there are enormous positives related to the technological revolution that happened. But quite clearly, we also know that there are the negatives. And maybe that's something that we can, talk about a little bit later. And maybe you can think of, what you see as positives and negatives about this, because I think it's a very interesting topic and it's a very important topic. So leading on then to the last big change, which obviously is the one that we are experiencing at the moment. When I taught the security module in GS 447, the globalization course, one of the courses I used to teach, I used to, before we started actually looking at the module itself, I used to ask the students what they felt were the most important threats facing the world in terms of security issues. And I would get students to sit together and, you know, sort of come up with ideas about sort of what the issues that they thought were sort of the most important. And there were the obvious ones, obviously things like nuclear proliferation, terrorism, economic crises. In more recent years, students started to talk about environmental issues and climate change, much in line with the rest of the world, as that has become more of an issue in recent years. And then afterwards, after we'd sort of looked at all this and we sort of talked about this, you know, they would ask me, they'd say, well, what do you think is the biggest threat that we face? Since I first taught the globalization course in semester 131, I had the same answer every single time, and that was a pandemic. Now, pandemics are not new. Coronavirus is not new. And if we actually think about what's happened since the beginning of this millennium, since the year 2000, we've had multiple breakouts of potential pandemics. You know, we've had SARS, Southeast Asian Respiratory Syndrome. In Saudi Arabia, you've had MERS in 2012 and 2015. There's been swine flu, there's been bird flu, there's been Zika in Brazil, there's been Ebola, there's been all sorts of things. And it seemed to me that it was really only a matter of time before one of these actually became something major, that became a global pandemic, which is what we've seen happen this year. We shouldn't really have been surprised because this was something that this has been going on for a long, long time. And pandemics are nothing new. I mean, I'm sure some of you, because of what's happened this year, have looked back at various pandemics. Those of you who studied with me will remember when we talked about Spanish flu, which of course was the terrible pandemic in 1918, 1919, which actually killed more people than the First World War. And that pandemic in those days spread around the globe by ship. Now, today, obviously, we see because of the way we live, because of the interconnected way we live, because of globalization, global travel, it's obvious that, how quickly and how easily COVID has been able to spread around the world. I actually think we've been lucky. And I think that's not something that we think enough about at the moment, but we certainly should. Because what if this COVID had been as deadly as MERS, which MERS we know is very, very dangerous. It's not as contagious as COVID, but it's deadlier. Now, what if this had been as deadly as MERS and as contagious as COVID is now? Because we wouldn't be looking at a relatively small number of people who have died from COVID in terms of percentage of population. We could potentially be looking at hundreds of millions dead, if not billions, because of the way that this is spread. So I think sometimes when we look at this, we sort of forget actually that we might actually have been quite lucky, and this actually might have been a bit of a warning to us to sort of prepare for the next one. I think that I had a personal experience which showed me, which I've quoted this personal experience to a lot of people, including people in governments in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, because I think it shows who was aware of the dangers of these and who wasn't. And that was, unfortunately, at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, I was very seriously ill with viral pneumonia.
Yeah, Dr. Mark. Okay, I think we have lost Dr. Mark because of some internet connection. Uh, Here we have in the meeting Dr. Flynn and
Oh, really? You're
I'm
oh,
back.
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
okay,
I don't know
okay.
what happened. It just disappeared. Yes. Okay. Anyway, so when I arrived, at the hospital, they were all in full protective gear um, before China. Now, why was that? Well, it was because they knew that I come from Saudi Arabia, and they were very, very concerned that I had MERS. Now, if the doctors at hospitals were that aware of the dangers of coronaviruses in early January, before the spread of this COVID out of Wuhan, then how come, a lot of people in governments weren't around the world? And I think this is, this is something that happened to me personally, but I think this is very telling. And it just showed you that, sort of a lot of people in the medical profession were completely prepared for this. In terms of the danger of the contagiousness of some of this. So we shouldn't look at COVID and we shouldn't look at the pandemic as being something A, unexpected, and B, something sort of completely new. And, oh my goodness, how did this happen? Because, as I said, these pandemics have been going on and they're happening all the time. How long will this last? Well, again, I think we can certainly look back at the experience, sort of what happened with other pandemics. We can see, for example, going back to Spanish flu, how actually Spanish flu, after a couple of years, mutated into another type of flu that is still with us. Swine flu is still with us. I know somebody who went in to get a test because she thought she had COVID. She was convinced she had COVID, and she went in to get a test, and they tested her. They said, you have got something, but it isn't COVID, it's swine flu. So that's still circulating as well. So a lot of these things that, that we think have sort of disappeared haven't. They're still with us. And I think this just shows us that really the best course of action is learning to adapt, to live with this, and to take, to learn a lot of lessons from this experience. Because as negative as this experience might have been for all of us, and as difficult as this experience that might have been for all of us, as I said, maybe actually this has been a warning to us, and that actually we now have to start thinking about, how we live, in our personally, how we live, in our communities, our societies, how we do things. Has COVID changed everything forever? I mean, will we go back to normal completely? I mean, that's something I think would be nice to talk about in a few minutes' time, because I think, I'm sure a lot of you have different opinions about this. Personally, I do think that things have changed, and I think there are a lot of things that probably will stay changed. Education obviously is something we can talk about in a minute, because this affects all of you personally, and everything that we've seen, and affects students all over the world. The way that we work, working from home, commuting to work, sort of traveling for conferences and work, and all of these types of things, which we've now seen change. Last January, I went to Princeton University from Dammam Airport for a 2-day workshop and flew straight back. I don't think I'm ever going to do that again in my life. I think that type of thing is over now. I'm not saying that there won't be in-person events, because I think there will be. But I think the way a lot of this has been done over the last few months has sort of opened new doors, has shown us other opportunities and other ways of doing things. As an example, at King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, where I work now, last year we had 65 events in total over the whole year. this year, since April to now, we've had 85. So we've had more events regardless of the pandemic, because obviously we've shifted online. We are now live streaming on Zoom, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram, and we're reaching a completely new audience as well. So that's actually, a positive that's come out of this. And, and I've said to my colleagues, I said, when we go back to, having in-person events again, which I'm sure we will, hopefully next year, we should still continue with what we're doing online, because obviously, actually, we've learned a lot out of this experience. And I think that obviously, when we think about the consequences or the ramifications of the pandemic, I think one of the questions that's interesting to think about is how has this affected globalization? Has it pushed globalization back? Has it pushed it forward? How is the world going to change because of this pandemic? Difficult to say. I mean, I think definite answers are very difficult at the moment because we're still in the midst of the pandemic. But I think it's something that maybe we can think about and maybe we can talk about in a minute. As I said, I think we've got to learn lessons from this one. We've got to be aware that the possibility of another pandemic is very high, because we've had so many already. And so it's not just really a question of sort of dealing with this one, but also with sort of preparing ourselves, if you like, for the next one when, unfortunately, it comes, because it probably will. So as a sort of concluding remark, I would say that, I'm 60 next year. I've learnt in my life that, sometimes life does just throw something like this at you and completely changes, your life. Everything that you sort of thought was set and important sort of gets thrown out of the window, and you have to sometimes sort of rethink everything. And I think you just have to be aware of that. These historical changes, we've just talked about these 3 historical changes. I mean, they can happen very quickly, and then suddenly you look back to even a year ago or something like that, and although it's not that long ago, it suddenly feels very long ago, because of the scale of change and because of all the questions that have been raised by this event. But I think, what can we learn from something negative like this as well? I think, a very important thing that you can learn is that, you sort of have to prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. And also, be aware that, life happens. I mean, things happen. Things that you haven't planned for happen. Everything gets thrown off course. That's just life, So you have to sort of make contingency plans. You have to have plan Bs. You have to have safety nets in place, because if we as human beings in our professional lives as well as in our personal lives, we have to be agile thinkers. We have to plan strategically. We can't definitely say what's going to happen, but we can think of scenarios. We can have plan Bs. We can prepare for things going wrong, because believe me, they do go wrong, and they will go wrong, as we've seen this year. And I think if you are, as an individual, as a university student thinking about to graduate or have graduated, if you can think strategically, then you're going to find that you're actually very sought after in the job market. So yes, these huge events can affect your life. Yes, they can affect your life in a very negative way sometimes, but you have to learn to take positives, and you have to use this experience to grow. And you have to draw out those positives, because actually, that can really help you in the future. One thing I've been telling a lot of my former students, a lot of junior researchers I work with, a lot of people that I mentor, both in Saudi Arabia, but also in other places. And I've been saying this to them sort of since the pandemic really sort of started, the lockdowns and the curfews and what have you started back in March. I've been saying to them, make sure that you do something productive during this period. Make sure that you've got something on your CV that is productive, because I can guarantee in a couple of years' time, you know, when you go for interviews, when people look at your CVs, they're going to look and they're going to say, okay, what did this person do during this time? How can we see whether this person's flexible? How can we see whether this person has taken a negative situation and actually drawn positives out of it, you know, for his own or her own individual growth? And I think this is a very important lesson. You know, we can learn from everything, even things that seem very bad, seem very negative, seem very difficult. We can still learn and we can still grow. And I think that's very, very important. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that there maybe are a lot of comments and questions. If you do have comments and questions or something that you think of tomorrow or the day after or next week, and you think, oh, I really wish I'd asked that, or I really would like to know about that, then, you know, please feel free to contact me at any time, either at my KFCRIS email, or you can obviously contact me through Twitter or LinkedIn. But please feel free to do that. And if you're ever in Riyadh, please come and see me. I'll be delighted to see you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. That was a very enriching proposal. I think we have Dr. Flynn and Mr. Yasser Dosari from,
Oh,
yeah.
who's talking?
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. So what would you like me to say? I mean, I enjoyed the talk. I enjoyed the talk. It's good to see you again, Dr. Mark. I guess, I suppose one issue that I had was in the latter half, when you're talking about COVID and about possible, you know, kind of paradigm changes in kind of like the structure of society. I was kind of, I mean, you mentioned about the amount of meetings that the King Faisal Center does and that it's increased in this period rather than decreased. I do think that, you know, there'll be, you know, if there is going to be a post-COVID world, going to be more acceptance, because I think we both know that, you know, when you go to a conference and then someone, you know, you're there in person and someone's there over Skype, that it feels there's a general attitude of that, well, why couldn't they bother coming? And it's just considered generally lesser than showing up in person. And I think that attitude definitely will change. But in terms of just an overall societal like paradigm shift, I'm not too sure that will necessarily be the case. Simply due to the resistance that you see in society. I mean, look at the British lockdowns at the moment right now. Britain, you know, the lockdown is...
Oh.
Sorry?
No, sorry. Yes.
Okay. Basically, the lockdown at present in Britain is that you can't go to the pub. And yet, you know, I mean, that's really it. Yeah, you can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to a pub. Everything else is perfectly fine. And, you know, the amount of vitriol received by that is, well, huge. They're saying he's listening to the scientists, which is actually considered a bad thing. So I just kind of think that perhaps, you know, for any society to change, there needs to be the will, obviously, of the majority, and even larger, maybe even a super majority of the people to respond to it. And so if that's not there, which arguably in a lot of Western countries it isn't, that kind of shift in the society might not actually occur. Though that's not saying whether it should or shouldn't. It's just a question of, you know, is versus ought, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's difficult. I mean, I don't think we can draw definitive conclusions at the moment because it's still ongoing. But I do think we're seeing, you know, that there are clearly some things that are changing. And I mean, I think, for example, flexi working from home, you know, there seems to be already, as you know, like a lot of the big corporations like Google and Microsoft and people like this have already told a lot of their employees that they wouldn't be going back to work anyway until summer 2021. I know a lot of people, like, you know, a lot of people I know have moved out of London already, and property prices in parts of the UK outside London are actually going up because people are moving out of the city because they don't actually need, or out of the London area because they no longer actually need to live there, because they've been told, well, you know, you're only going to be coming into work, you know, twice a week, or one person I know it's once a month now. So she's American, but she's relocated to Edinburgh because rent's 3 times cheaper. So I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean personally, I mean, I was, you know, the first day I was able to put work clothes on and go back to the office, I was absolutely thrilled. You know, it was like, I never thought I'd be so happy to go back to the office, but I was, because I was so sick of working from home, you know. So no, I mean, but there's all sorts of interesting questions, I think, that are raised by sort of what we see happening at the moment, and I think what parts of society might change. I mean, you know, what, or might not, of course. And are we going to go back to completely the way we were before? I'm not sure about that. You know, I think it's, and again, I think it probably, you can't really have a general answer, you know, generalized answer. I mean, I think it will depend very much on specific societies, specific countries, specific environments, and depending, you know, and obviously depending on, I suppose, as well, how seriously the pandemic has affected your community, because quite clearly some places have been a lot more badly affected than others. I mean, life in Saudi Arabia is fairly normal in comparison to, say, London, you know, which for those of you who know London, who might be listening and who've been to London, I mean, central London is deserted still, and it's very strange. I mean, you go on the tube in London and the underground in London, and all the posters on the walls are for films and movies are from March. You know, it's just sort of weird. But no, I mean, I don't know. Has anybody else got any thoughts of this?
Thank you.
No. Hi, Abdurrahman.
Hello. Thanks for the informative talk.
How are you?
First. I'm doing well, very well. So what I wanted to say is the pandemic most probably is not changing things to a total new state. For the most part, it's just accelerating changes that we were hesitant to adopt as societies. Things like remote working or remote education and this kind of stuff, they were definitely coming at some point in the future. But we were not ready or even dealing with it with an open mind to adopt such a big change in the lifestyle. So now after we have tried it, we have seen its benefits, we have seen its negatives. Societies all around the world would be more acceptable to introduce such kind of stuff when appropriate and when it's giving an edge over traditional ways of working or things. So it's more like giving us a window to try new things. It's basically accelerating the world, the development of the world in certain aspects.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what you're saying there. I mean, I was having a conversation with a former United States ambassador in Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago, and who works at one of the major think tanks there. And, you know, he was saying it, he was saying it's funny, he said, because, you know, we had all this technology before, it's just that we didn't really sort of use it, you know, or we didn't really sort of use it very effectively. And it's only really because of what's happened over the last year that sort of, if you like, forced our hand. We had to sort of, you know, if we didn't actually do this, if we didn't actually start using this technology in this sort of ways, we wouldn't have been able to sort of continue sort of doing the sort of events, the discussions, the participation with other institutions, because we were no longer able to sort of to have them in person, and then of course we weren't able to travel internationally. So yes, I mean, and that ties in with really what you were saying, that, you know, that it has, if you like, maybe sort of accelerated it. But as I said before, I mean, I you know, thinking about where I'm working now. I mean, we will definitely go back to having in-person lectures and in-person seminars and workshops and what have you, hopefully, but we will still continue to sort of do the things that we've been doing over the last few months, because if in a way that sort of adds, it's an addition, to what we were doing before. I mean, I see it as the best option in terms of where we've been over the past few months. I do miss the in-person events, because obviously it's not just about what happens during the event or during the conference or during the seminar or what have you, but it's also that sort of engagement that you have with people afterwards, over coffee, or people you meet by accident that you would not normally meet, and that the way you can build your networks through those sort of social engagements, if you like, which of course you don't get when you're doing these type of activities. And yes, I mean, I do miss that. And like I just said, I mean, I was delighted to go back to the office, because I just working through Zoom is it's okay, but but it got to the point where you just sort of feel that you live on Zoom, and that becomes your life, and that's a bit strange. Yeah, yes, I mean, I think it, going back to, the way it might change work, or flexi work, or working from home, and or what have you. And that obviously was also very dependent on the sector that we're talking about, because obviously this is, the pandemic has affected different sectors in different ways. And of course, some sectors have done very well, and some companies have done extremely well. Zoom, for example, or Amazon, or what have you. But yeah, I mean, is it, the way we shop, I suppose, and things like that. I mean, we used to shop online before the pandemic, but how much, to what extent has that sort of increased, and to what extent is that going to continue? I mean, for example, I mean, Amazon are now, have started Amazon Fresh, where they're now also delivering food, and of course that's having in some countries, of course, that's going to challenge a lot of the traditional supermarkets and what have you, because Amazon, have such an enormous logistical operation that they can actually sort of deliver food far faster in some countries. So I mean, I think, there's a lot of things that are happening at the moment, and there's a lot of things that might happen. And I think it's, as I said before, I think it's sort of difficult maybe to sort of draw sort of like, definitive sort of answers to some of these questions, but quite clearly we have to think about these questions, and we have to think about the way that they might impact on our lives. And certainly for you as either as undergraduates now, or as postgraduates, or some of you have probably graduated and are working, obviously I think you obviously need to think about these issues as well, because quite clearly they could have an impact on your future careers. Mohammed? Hello, Mohammed. Mohammed? Ali, can you let Mohammed?
Yes, hello, Dr. Thompson. How are you? I hope you are doing very well.
I think I know you, don't I?
Yes.
I recognize your name. How are you?
Good, alhamdulillah. What about you?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm fine. Nice to speak to you again. It's been, what was it? Was it 181?
I think yes, 181. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I thought you studied with me.
It's been a long time.
It has indeed, hasn't it?
Yeah. So what my thought is about, if we go to the normal life, we will have the same life before the pandemic. Why? Because we as a human, we like to socialize and communicate with each other face to face. And also the productivity, it will be, I think it will be higher in the workplace than the home. So that's my thought. Yani, we will, if we go back to the normal life, it will be similar before the pandemic. there's one thing that might change, that if there's rain, then KFUPM will hold their lectures online, so we will not get any holiday.
Oh, yes, yes, I remember those. I mean, I mean, what about, so how, I mean, have you noticed it had a significant impact on your productivity?
I think yes.
Mhm. In what way?
Well, you studies at same room, you take the lectures at same room, so it is difficult to increase your productivity. That's what I thought about.
No, I think, I mean, that is a very important point. I mean, I think, I mean, I personally don't particularly like working from home, but it was something that we had to do. We didn't have any choice, but I think you need to be very self-disciplined, and you have to sort of maintain, you have to keep your sort of motivation levels up very high as well, because it is difficult, I think. I was very conscious of, I had a routine. I got up at 6 a.m. every day regardless, and I started work at a sort of a normal time, and I did a full day's work every single day, and I made myself do that. But it is, it is very strange, and it's an odd way to just sort of to live. Certainly, there's no doubt about it. It's not an experience that I particularly want to go through again. But if necessary, I suppose we would. But my productivity was fine, but I had to work at it, if you know what I mean. And I'm sure I mean, maybe some of you might want to, I don't know, does anybody want to talk about what it's been like for them studying during this period? Hello?
Yes. Well, studying, I think sometimes I have to change my place so I can change the mode of myself or change the environment so I can continue studying and increase the productivity. So you have to change you have to change your place so that you can increase your productivity. That's my thoughts.
Anyway, thank you, Mohammed. Anyone else?
Yeah, for
Uh,
me, Dr. Thompson, I think I lost the concept of day because everything is connected to everything. I'm doing everything at the same place. Uh, the respect for weekdays and weekends, for work hours and leisure hours, let's say, all of those borders, uh, let's say, disappeared. So it is exhausting, first of all, and uh, trying to maintain a routine is way more difficult than the previous state when we were forced to attend at certain places for certain events or so when everything is at the same place, I think it is more difficult to maintain a healthy routine.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, like I just said. And I think one of the things that obviously a lot of people are looking at around the world, and a lot of people are studying, of course, is the the effects that this year had on the sort of the mental well-being of people, in terms of their mental health, because obviously we've seen a lot of people. This has put a lot of strain on a lot of people, caused a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, um, precisely because the situation has not been normal, and precisely because we've had to live in really rather strange ways. I'm actually just I'm actually just finishing writing a paper on this, about the effect of the pandemic on sort of the mental well-being of young Saudis, which I've done sort of quite extensive research over the last sort of 3 months. And it is very interesting to sort of see how it's impacted on different people in different ways.
Okay, Dr. Thompson, I just want to let the audience share their thoughts about all the agenda, not just a certain topic of it. So if anyone wants to ask something or add anything,
Yes,
please feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. It is open now.
So we've got 2 participants raise their hands. So Tarek has raised his hand.
Hello, Dr. Thompson.
Hi, Tarek.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I enjoyed every bit of it. I was wondering when you mentioned, should I raise my voice? Excuse me. Is my voice clear now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes. Hello, Tarek.
Yeah. Hello, Dr. Thompson. Thank you for your wonderful speech. I really enjoyed every bit of it. I was wondering, what you mentioned that London is way worse than us, Central London in particular. I was wondering what is different there than in Saudi Arabia. So in the image in my mind that London is maybe, or England is more advanced than Saudi Arabia. So I thought they'd have better taken better measurements to be prepared. So I was wondering what's different there. Thank you.
Have you got 3 hours?
I'm really interested.
This is where I go on a rant. Well, I mean, one of the reasons that London is central London is particularly deserted, of course, is that there are no tourists. And those of you who've been to London, of course, will know that, you know, London is usually, regardless of what time of year you go there, is very busy with lots of tourists. But with this year, of course, there are, you know, almost none. And in fact, Heathrow Airport, which has 5 terminals, at the moment, only 2 of those terminals are open. And that's one terminal for British Airways alone. And then there's Terminal 2, which is for all other airlines. And even that's not particularly busy. So, you know, when you take the tourists out of central London, you suddenly have a very, 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 very quiet place. But obviously that's, you know, and I would imagine, I mean, I obviously haven't traveled to other tourist destinations because, you know, we haven't been able to, but you know, when you look at the photographs, for example, of a lot of these places, you sort of see the same situation. So it is, yeah, I mean, I mean, I'm from London originally. It's certainly very odd, you know, to be walking around London, you know, and Oxford Street, Regent Street, these sort of Covent Garden, these sort of places, and there's almost nobody there. Certainly in the mornings, you know, it gets busier in the evenings, but the mornings are absolutely so quiet. I mean, I always used to joke, I think, with my students, you know, when we taught at KFUPM, and I used to say that, you know, when in the summer in particular, when I was walking around London, I often used to wonder if I was the only British person there, you know, but obviously that's completely changed. So, yeah, but once you get out of the centre, you know, and you go to the suburbs where people actually live, then it's a different story. And of course, there it's actually very busy, precisely because everybody's working from home. So actually, the business, if you like, the money that's being spent, you know, what's being spent outside in shops and things like that, you know, is sort of no longer being spent in the centre, if you like, because people are not going to work in the centre. You know, they're working from home, so it's all sort of being spent more locally. So it's sort of a redistribution of wealth. And as I, you know, just mentioned just before about, you know, people realising actually that they might not actually need to live in a certain place because they're not actually, you know, they're not physically working there anymore. They're actually, you know, they're working online, so they actually can therefore relocate to another part of the country where it's cheaper. So these are things that we definitely have seen happening. To what extent they'll continue to happen, to whether it's a long-term trend, I don't know. It's too early to say. I mean, you know, I think when we look at the it is interesting to look at the way that different governments and different places have tackled the pandemic, and you know, the pandemic has had different impacts in different places as well. It's you know, it's very complex, you know. So I'll leave it at that because somebody just asked this, so there's lots of other questions. Yes. Okay. Sorry, Ali. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Ahmed, I can see. Who's next? Ali, yes.
Yeah, okay, Walid. Go ahead.
Waleed.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Thompson.
Hi, Waleed.
Hi. I hope you're safe and well in this situations.
I am. I'm fine,
Everything.
thank you.
So, as you mentioned, COVID-19 has left a huge impact on everything, in every aspect of life. And I believe that education had its fair share of that. So, my question is, did COVID-19 show that there are many opportunities in the educational field, or it just proved that there is no alternative for our traditional physical education? So I'd like to hear your opinion on this.
Well, I mean, I think education obviously has, education, a lot of education has shifted online because it sort of had to, as we know. But I mean, that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't online education and distance education before. I mean, you only have to look at Saudi Electronic University, for example, although, of course, even those students who attend Saudi Electronic University say that, of course, they did, pre-pandemic, they did actually go to a certain number of in-person classes as well, which they missed. But there's that's a very good example here of something that was already in place. A very good friend of mine, a Saudi academic, who he actually is a technical education specialist, and he looks at this in a lot of depth. But he published a paper not that long ago, and we actually had a King Faisal Center a webinar on this a few months ago as well. And he says that the main thing that we should look at is that we shouldn't just be looking at this as sort of a shift to distance learning. He actually calls it crisis distance learning, in that we were forced into this at a very short, in a very short period of time. We were sort of forced into this, and we were sort of, whether you're an educator, whether you're a student, whether you're an administrator, a lecturer, what have you, this was something that we didn't have a choice about. We sort of suddenly had to do it, and we had to respond to this sort of crisis, which is not actually the same as sort of distance learning that is designed, planned, and then implemented as distance learning, not because that there's a pandemic. So I think that is a very important distinction, and I really like Dr. Abdul's term when he calls this crisis distance learning, because I do think that sort of sums it up. I mean, I think obviously there are benefits to both. I mean, and I think that I would feel. I mean, I haven't obviously taught this year, but I think I would. One thing, if I was still teaching, I would miss that sort of classroom engagement with students and the conversations after class and people coming to my office and things, which was part of when I worked at KFUPM, which was part of the job that I really enjoyed, and that really mirrors what I was saying about the conferences and going to conferences and seminars and what have you. You can still do the conferences and things like this, but you don't have that sort of personal engagement sort of afterwards, if you like. So I think that that's something that's similar, but obviously there's a lot that we can learn from the situation, and there's a lot whether you are somebody who designs courses, whether you are somebody who teaches courses, whether you are somebody who runs an educational institution. There's a great deal that we can learn from this experience, and hopefully sort of make sure that what is delivered, what educational content that is delivered online can be improved because of the experience that we've gone through. Ali?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hi,
Yeah,
Ahmed.
we can hear you.
Sorry, I couldn't continue. My name is Ahmed Dawood.
Hello, Ahmed.
Yeah, hello, all Dr. Mark.
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Thank you. I want to thank you for this great talk that you have given us. I must say that there is a phrase that you always have said in class that's always stuck in my mind, which is history repeats itself. I would say, yeah, that's where so they are saying, and that's my voice is not clear. Or what?
I can't hear you very well, Ahmed.
How about now?
I think it
Is
sounds
it
better.
Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah. So history repeats itself. I would say we could have thank technology that actually we have learned from previous pandemics that happened before, and it helped us. But there's a thought that is in my mind, which is, what if this pandemic, especially the COVID, have happened before? For example, the Cold War, where none of these technologies that have helped us a lot during this time certificate a lot of things. So what if COVID had happened this time? How life would have changed? Because some are saying that COVID actually have connected some of the countries, that we all getting to this point that all the countries are aiming to find a cure to this pandemic, and they are helping each other, connecting the information that we have. Would it have changed the Cold War and the separation and the things that have happened at that time? I want to hear their thoughts.
Firstly, Ahmed, I recognize your voice now. How are you? It's nice to hear your voice again, because you studied with me twice, didn't you? But quite a long time ago now, isn't it? Yes, no, I recognize your voice. It's lovely to hear from you. Well, I mean, actually, there were flu pandemics during the Cold War. As I said, as I said earlier on, I mean, these things have, these things are not new. They've happened lots of times, and there was a big, I think it was 1957 when there was a big one as well. So, these things have happened even during that time. I think you made an important point there about the fact that we can only really solve these global problems by working together, and that something like this as a global issue is actually going to require us to work together far more effectively than sometimes we do in the past. Because I think one of the things that these, what they do, of course, is that they highlight our sort of common humanity, if you like, because a virus doesn't care who we are or where we're from or what our background is, or and so it affects all of us as human beings in the world, and that's what sort of, I think it's quite a sobering moment, and I think it really, we should reflect on that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Abdurrahman, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Thompson. First, I want to thank you.
Hi, Abdurrahman.
First, I want to thank you about the lecture. It was very informative. I wanted to ask you about remote work. So with this pandemic, it's now everybody is working remotely. If let's say the pandemic stayed with us, or even if the pandemic ended, but remote work stayed with us, and the people still work. Some companies prefer their employees to work remotely. Will this affect the job market? Like, will people from other countries cheaper labor? Will companies prefer cheaper labor from other companies over local employees?
I think again, probably this also depends on the sector that we're looking at, the type of work, the type of company, the type of employees that they have. I don't think there's one answer that fits, all of this, because quite clearly remote working, works for some types of jobs and not for others, and works for some sectors and not for others. But quite clearly, there are companies in the world who realize that actually, they're going to save money if they can actually have a certain percentage of their employees working from home, that they don't have to, they don't have to sort of rent or buy the same amount of office space as they used to in the past. I mean, I know, going back to London, I know a colleague of mine in the City of London who works at a big financial firm there where they have 5,000 employees, but they only actually have 200 in working. And they've only had 200 in working for the past however many months, and they're actually, thinking about, some of this, some of the home working becoming sort of permanent so that they can downsize their offices. But then that obviously has an impact on the, the service industries that provide services to these sort of office workers. When, if the office workers aren't there, then there isn't the work for the service industries. And so there's a sort of knock-on effect from that, which in a service economy such as the United Kingdom's economy, is obviously having a big impact. I mean, it's very. I don't think there's a single answer, Abdul Rahman, for that. I think you really need to look at, what type of work, what type of sector, and how it's going to sort of impact on that sector, because quite clearly some sectors probably won't be affected at all.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. I will ask you a question here in the chat. Abdulaziz says, will the presence of other poles in the world, such as China and Russia, affect the future of globalization? And will the current US elections also affect the globalization?
I wondered how long it would be before we got around to the election. My goodness. That's a big question, and well, it's more than one question, is it? There's lots of questions there. Yeah, I mean, we, quite clearly we're seeing, the pandemic has had an impact on. I mean, that was a question I asked you as well about sort of how you see globalization, whether you see it sort of increasing, decreasing, or what have you, because of sort of the effect of the pandemic. I mean, quite clearly, it's sort of changing relationships. It's changing the way countries are interacting with each other. It's changing perceptions of countries, which I think is very interesting. I mean, a lot of people, of course, have been very surprised that, sort of countries that they thought would sort of handle the pandemic better haven't, and countries that they didn't think would handle the pandemic so well actually have. And so it's sort of thrown things it's thrown up lots and lots of surprises, of course. I mean, as to what happens tomorrow, I mean, I'm not going to make any predictions, because for those of you who studied with me in 2016, you'll remember that I said that if Donald Trump wins the election, I'm going to change the course book to Harry Potter. And I've never, ever lived that down. I still have people contacting me about that. So I don't know. What I do think, obviously the election is incredible. This is an incredibly important election. It will have a major impact on America's role in the world, and also, of course, sort of bilateral relations with other states. I know that there are polls, I know that there are predictions and everything, but I'm not going to say one way or another, because this year has been so unpredictable in so many ways that I wouldn't want to say one way or the other, but yes, it is a very important election, and it is going to have, consequences, regardless of who wins, will obviously have consequences for everybody everywhere.
Okay, Abdullah, go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Thompson.
Hello.
Hello, nice to see you.
Yes, you too.
Okay. Prior to the COVID-19, we heard some journalists and experts claiming that the United States is losing its position as the
major power or the controlling power over the free country, of the free world, I believe. Do you believe that COVID-19 will trigger this change in the power of the United States over the whole world?
I mean, we actually recently were asked to, the King Faisal Centre, we were actually commissioned to write a special report. I can't say who by, but it was somebody very high up. And we actually had to scenario plan, excuse me, scenario plan, if you like, as to what a second Trump presidency, second Trump term, or what a Biden presidency might look like, and the impact that it would have on the United States and on the United States relationships with its major sort of trading partners and its major sort of allies. And we obviously, I was the editor of the report, and we sort of broke it down into sort of various sectors. So we obviously had a China specialist look at sort of Sino-American relations, and we looked at the economy, we looked at security issues, and I actually looked at COVID and sort of how COVID might impact on this. But and really sort of one of the conclusions that we came to was that, of course, that the next president, whoever that is, their bandwidth, if you like, is going to be taken up so much by dealing with the ramifications of the pandemic in the United States and trying to sort of get a grip on what's been happening there, especially as we go into sort of the worst of the winter. And that really maybe is going to, sort of take up a lot of time, if you like, of whoever is the president. I mean, it's difficult to say, but quite clearly, you can't underestimate the impact of that. I mean, as you said, a lot of people have been arguing about a sort of, so-called American retreat from the world and the rise of China and other sort of groupings as well. We've seen Donald Trump sort of obviously sort of remove America from a lot of multilateral organizations or agreements and what have you, and quite clearly, sort of have a different sort of view of the world. I don't think that, if Joe Biden wins, we don't know, I don't necessarily think that if Joe Biden wins, that everything sort of there's going to be sort of like, if you like, a reset, as it were, to sort of pre-2016. I think that's a very simplistic way to look at things. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, because a lot of happened since 2016, and clearly, Trump, if he's not president, he still leaves a legacy, and he's still, whether you support President Trump or you don't support President Trump, he's still changed a lot of things, and he's still changed a lot of the way that politics operates and America's relationships as well. I don't know. I mean, it's going to, the next few days is going to be very interesting. It might be a lot longer than that. It might be weeks, it might be months, depending on what happens, until we maybe have a fuller picture of what's going to go on. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting time. Ali?
Yeah, go ahead, Tariq.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, Dr. Thompson. I hope you and everyone here are staying healthy. Just like they say in the medical field, I hope you are being positive and testing negative.
Yes, absolutely.
My question to you, Dr. Thompson, how do you predict we're gonna handle the next pandemic, if any? Like not to sound pessimistic, but how exactly will we handle it?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, first of all, I don't think it is being pessimistic. I think it's being realistic. I mean, I think we have to, to learn the lessons of the past. And, it's interesting when you look at those states such as Taiwan, well, that's not a state, but, look at countries like Taiwan, for example, or some of the other Asian states, and how they've handled COVID-19, and also how you've handled it here in Saudi Arabia, which I think is another very interesting example, because of course you had MERS here in 2005, 2012 and 2015, and coronavirus was a word that a lot of people outside, a lot of people around the world had never heard of until this year, and probably hope they never hear again. But, you know, I mean, we would, you know, I remember reading about coronavirus in the Saudi papers back in, you know, 2012 and what have you. So quite clearly, you know, Saudi Arabia learned a lot of lessons from this experience. I mean, the fact that Saudi Arabia shut down its borders so quickly, I think, was, you know, obviously indicative of that. And others, you know, and there are other states, other countries who have learned those lessons quite as well. I mean, mask wearing is something, of course, which has been quite contentious in some places, and yet we know, for example, you know, if you look at the Asian societies, you know, what mask wearing is actually fairly normal. And I remember even when I lived in Korea in the 90s, people used to wear masks, particularly in the winter months. So, you know, so maybe, you know, some of the health sort of precautions, some of the awareness, if you like, that the more awareness we have of these sort of things, maybe that's sort of something that actually, you know, we can sort of take forward. And so that we are more prepared, if you like, for, you know, something like this happening again, because we don't know. I mean, it might not happen on this scale again in our lifetimes. It might happen in 5 years. I mean, but I think I think it's like the better prepared you are, the better you're able to handle something like this. Ali?
Yeah, okay, Rabih, go ahead.
Hello again. I had lots of comments about things that people said, but it would take too long.
We're running out of time, I think, as well.
Yeah. So I will be short. And what do you think the effect of this pandemic on globalization will be? As already so many big cities are shrinking, jobs, people are moving out. Also, global supply chains are changing massively. Also, in addition to the pandemic, what would another presidency of Donald Trump, how would it affect the global scene from the point of view of globalization? Yeah.
Quite a lot of questions there. I would recommend. I mean, I think, I the question I raised, when I said to you when I was talking about, do you think that, how is this going to change sort of globalization? Are we going to see a retreat of globalization? Is it going to advance globalization? I think the interesting thing that we're actually seeing happen, of course, is that, again, in different aspects, if we look at sort of the online world, the way that as we've just said, the way we've sort of been forced to embrace sort of this technology to carry on our daily lives, and obviously that's increased that enormously. But at the same time, the way we've been forced to close borders, we've been forced to stop traveling, that sort of physical interconnectedness obviously has diminished enormously, and that obviously is, we know is going to have sort of major economic consequences for companies, in tourism, the travel industry, airlines, and things like this. We're going to have been so badly affected by this, and a lot of them are not going to recover, particularly if the next few months are as difficult as sort of the first wave, if you want to call it, was. So I think it's very uneven, and I think it depends what part of it you're looking at. I mean, does it? I think there's lots of questions of about how this is impacting on people's perceptions of nationalism, how it's impacting on people's thoughts about immigration, and I mean it's raised a lot of questions because it's had an impact right across the board. But it is very uneven, and I think, again, like this is just to repeat what I said before. It's maybe in a year's time we can sort of draw sort of more conclusions from this. But something that I've been saying to a lot of people is that we haven't yet gone through a full cycle of this. It's sort of, okay, it started in China in sort of January, but the impact of this sort of globally wasn't really until sort of sort of a couple, sort of a month or so later. So, so until we get to March 2021, we wouldn't have been through one full cycle. So I think it's very difficult to really sort of, until we've experienced the winter, if you like, and until we've gone through the second wave, if that's what it is, or depending on how you look at it, I think it's I think when we get to March next year, it's going to be easier to sort of be able to sort of say, okay, right now we've been through a whole, we're a year into this. Where were we this time last year? What have we learned in that year? And I think once we're there, it's going to be a bit easier. As for the questions about the presidency, well, let's wait till after the election, shall we? Ali?
Yeah.
I think we've run out of time, haven't we?
Yeah, I wish we can hear more from you, but unfortunately, we run out of time.
And another time.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this enriching webinar that broadened our minds. We are very glad that you accepted our invitation. Thank you again, and good night.
Thank you very much to everybody, and please feel free to get in touch with me, okay? I'd be more than happy to hear from you. Everybody, take care, stay safe, and hope to speak to you again soon.
Yeah, goodbye.